Okay. To begin with, I want to express my appreciation to these particular people, many of whom are in this room, who have in some very special and important way contributed information that I have picked up on in this talk. And then, which none of these names here would surprise anybody, surprisingly though, and kind of horrifyingly, a book that I found in the Rice University Library where I study is this book, The Making of a National Poet by the Stratfordian Michael Dobson, who furnished me with some significant information that I've incorporated into this talk. Now, I have divided the evolutionary process of the development of the Stratford narrative into three parts. The first I'm calling maintenance. It started from circa 1580s, whenever whoever is writing the plays, and I think it's Edward de Vere, is underway writing the plays. And it lasts until 1700, circa 1700. Maybe a little bit before, maybe a little bit after, but I'm picking 1700. Then we have phase two, which I'm calling the scrubbing. And I will explain in a few minutes why I've used that term scrubbing for it. That started circa 1700 and it lasted to 1769. Then we have maintenance, which starts at 1769 and continues to the present time. Nicely, we do have this very clear line of demarcation of between phases 2 and 3 at 1769, and I know everybody in this room knows what took place in 1769. We had the Stratford Jubilee, which was, I believe, a celebration of the successful implementation of the Stratford legend, or Stratford narrative, whichever you want to call it. Now, there was a lot to celebrate in 1769 because three powerful forces had been put in place or set in motion. First is the Shakespeare industry. No one in this room is going to find any problems with these three powerful forces. Shakespeare industry was underway. Secondly, it had acceptance by authority. Initially, the editors of the 1700s, starting with Rowe and Pope and Theobald and Hanmer and Warburton and Samuel Johnson, and then continuing with the next round of editors in the next century, and ultimately academic acceptance, which is something we're really up against these days. Third was the public buy-in. The public got it based on this idealized persona of the Stratford man as the greatest of all Englishmen and a national hero. Let's see. So my major point today is that in phase two is when these three powerful forces were set in motion. So phase two is where the action is, and that's where I'm going to spend most of my talk today. However, I do need to say a word about maintenance, because once something is put in place, it's a lot easier to keep it in place. It's called maintaining the status quo, so we can all understand that. I do want to say a word to everyone here that we have made the maintenance a whole lot harder for the Stratfordians. Thank you all so much for that. But obviously we wouldn't have phase three without phase two, and we wouldn't have phase two without phase one. And so we do need to start with phase one and say a few things about phase one. Because the works had been, and this whole process, developmental creative process, had been a secret to start with. Now, I want you to bear in mind three things. First of all, and there are other things for us to know, but first of all is this £1,000 annuity that Queen Elizabeth gave to Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. I talk about it at great detail in my book, chapter 7 in my book, for more details on this. But we do know that it is mystery money, and a real incredible thing is the non-accountability clause that was attached to this money. Then I want to tell you about, those of you already know, Raymond Jimenez's wonderful article, 10 Eyewitnesses Who Saw Nothing, which is really a commentary on how nobody really knew anything back then. I was at an event a while back at the Ashland Seminar, and I told Raymond that I said, I've got another eyewitness who saw nothing for you, and he laughed, and he said, people are always telling me that. But at any rate, it's just a real commentary on this whole developmental process that was going on initially. And then, of course, there's the first folio, to which I point out Roger Strittmatter's excellent collection of essays, his own and wonderful observations that he has put together in his Brief Chronicles article, and actually edition of the first folio that he edited a few years ago, including Richard Whalen's fine article called The Ambiguous Ben Jonson. But you think of these things, and something's just not adding up, right? It's just not quite making sense. So, but at any rate, what happened, and maybe it just faded away once subsequent generations are coming along, right? People just forgot about it. Actually, no. There was a group of people. They were called the Great Two Circle. How many of you have ever heard of the Great Two Circle? A few of you have, yes. These were gatherings that were held at the home, at Great Two, the home of Lord Falkland, Lucius Carey, Viscount Falkland, and one of the members was Sir John Suckling. And here he is painted by Sir Anthony Van Dyck in 1637, holding a Shakespeare folio. It is unknown if it's a first folio or a second folio, but it is most assuredly a Shakespeare folio that he is holding. Now, this group held their gatherings, and members of the group included Edward Hyde. He has 2 granddaughters that are going to be queens of England. When I say that these people are very well connected and very well positioned, I'm not kidding. Queen Mary of William and Mary is his granddaughter, and Queen Anne is his granddaughter. Pretty important person. Dudley Digges, the name Digges ringing a bell? Yes, it's his younger brother who wrote one of the tributes to Shakespeare, the first folio, and he is a distinguished member of Parliament. Abraham Cowley, he's one of the most eminent poets of the next generation. He's in this group. John Selden, he's one of the most famous lawyers of the time after the passing of Sir Francis Bacon. I mean, look at the names. When I say that these people are at the top of their professions, of their walks of life, who are gathering together in this group. And they held a debate about Shakespeare. The debate was held at Eton in the lodgings of the clergyman John Hales, who, again, is one of the most eminent clergymen of the time. And the debate was about the comparative merits of Shakespeare versus the classical poets. How interesting that they noticed. According to the report, Shakespeare won. The decision was given unanimously in Shakespeare's favor. Now, that's quite lovely, but it brings to mind a couple of questions. Why aren't they asking more questions around Stratford-upon-Avon? Why don't they go there? After all, Mr. Shakspere's 2 daughters were still living in the 1630s. They could have gone to the home where Mr. Shakespeare himself lived, and surely track down manuscripts, maybe rough drafts of things, letters, theatrical memorabilia. Sure. In fact, why didn't the Great Two Circle have their debate in Stratford-upon-Avon? Now, we know that the next, this is in the 1630s. 1640s, we have the Civil War, and in the 1650s, England has the Protectorate with Oliver Cromwell. So in 1660, we have the Restoration. Shortly after the Restoration, a man whose name was the Reverend John Ward had the appointment to become the next vicar in Stratford-upon-Avon, where Shakespeare at the Holy Trinity Church, where Mr. Shakespeare is buried. And the Reverend Ward kept diaries, which, by the way, were not published until 1839. But this is very important, what he wrote in his diary. What he said is, I have heard that Mr. Shakespeare was a natural wit. This natural wit thing is floating around, without any art at all. The Great Two Circle knew better than that, but at any rate, this is what's floating around. He frequented the plays all his younger time, but in his elder days lived at Stratford and supplied the stage with 2 plays every year, and for it had an allowance so large that he spent at the rate of £1,000 a year, as I have heard. What a lovely piece of hearsay. Okay, well, something's still floating around. A professor at Rutgers University, I was looking around at things, and he made this comment that actually an indication that interest had not waned in the remaining of the 1600s, this century, because there was a pretty steady production of Shakespeare folios. And it's kind of interesting that the first folio in the reign of King James, second folio in the reign of his son, King Charles, as well as the Shakespeare poem, 1640. Then, of course, we have the Interregnum. Third folio in the reign of King Charles II, and fourth folio is published in the reign of King James II. How interesting is that? And also, King Charles II, upon his restoration, licensed 2 acting companies, one of which was dedicated to performing the works of William Shakespeare. Of course, they were Bowdlerized according to the taste of the time, but Shakespeare was becoming very important. In fact, according to Michael Dobson, that book that I was telling you, I was so horrified to find things in there that just about everything in there that is very worthwhile to know about. He said, after the Restoration, Shakespearean tragedies arrived at the center of the serious repertory. The actor Thomas Betterton was established as the greatest actor of the time, the great tragedian, playing Hamlet, Othello, Macbeth, and other Shakespearean roles. So, with all this interest continuing of these things, the Great Two Circle, the clergyman who's writing about things that are floating around, and the folios of Shakespeare's works published in the reign of each Stuart monarch, and the popularity of the plays, why did nearly a century go by? Why this time has elapsed with the Stratford man not really being widely and officially recognized in Stratford-upon-Avon? For example, why in the world is a Shakespeare Jubilee in Stratford held in 1769 instead of 1669? Why do we have to wait another 100 years? Well, there's a reason for that. That wasn't entirely a rhetorical question. Living memory has to run its course. Everybody who knew anything, if the story's not true, everybody who knew anything about this man from Stratford had to die. All the witnesses had to be dead and gone. And the dying out process usually takes about 80 years. If you look at the Stratford man dying in 1616, and of course the first folio, 1623, so if you took roughly 1620 as a date for the beginning of the follow-up to the Shakespeare production of Shakespeare canon, and you look at 1700, you're looking at about 80 years before the real scrubbing process is going to get started. Now, what I mean by scrubbing, I have co-opted this term from information technology. It's not quite the same thing in information technology, but the concept is sort of the same. The deal is if you want to put new information out there, or if you want to get rid of something else, you can't do it by simply erasing it. You have to superimpose new information and put that in front of people. And then the old stuff is gone for good, whatever might be hanging around. So that's why I'm calling this the scrubbing. It's not getting rid of old information, is putting in forth implementation of new information. The scrubber, meet the scrubber. His name is Nicholas Rowe, and he set forth what is pretty much considered the first biography of the man from Stratford in his edition of 1709. I don't know if you can see this. It's an account of the life and writings of the author. Now, he understood that he was putting forth new information because he said, for the most considerable part of these passages relating to his life, which I have here transmitted to the public. So he had some awareness that this is exactly what he was doing. He has a comment in this account of the life. He says, my Lord Southampton at one time gave him £1,000 to enable him to go through with a purchase which he had a mind to, a bounty very great and very rare at any time. Now, what I want to point out, and I know bells are going off in everybody's mind right now. Yes, we've seen this £1,000 before, haven't we? The Reverend John Ward talks about the £1,000 a year and an allowance. Who paid this allowance? Where does £1,000 a year? Does it just drop out of the sky? No, actually, Rowe hasn't answered the question. Well, my Lord Southampton gave him £1,000 a year, which of course can't possibly be true, but that's what he is putting out here. What we understand is, well, where did the idea of the £1,000 come from? Everybody in this room knows what my next slide is going to be. Yes, this is the book of the records of Elizabeth's Exchequer, where she sent this Privy Seal warrant dormant was her command to her Exchequer to pay Edward de Vere. It's here. Oh, no, see, I tried to enlarge it for you. Here we have the Earl of Oxford, and the warrant is dormant, which means that it's going to roll and roll and roll until she gives a command to stop it. To pay him £1,000, good and lawful money of England, to the sum to be yearly delivered and paid. There's your £1,000 a year. Now, the funny thing about it is this £1,000 has been reverberating, and like stories that are just hanging out there and nobody quite knows what's going on, but it's been picked up twice. Once, of course, by Reverend Ward, and the next time by Nicholas Rowe. And it's been changed up a little bit because that's what happens to rumors as they're floating. But what I believe is that the fact that this £1,000 is associated with Shakespeare, which means it's associated with plays, is a pretty good indicator that Chief Justice Stevens and others were correct when they say that the purpose of this £1,000 a year was the Queen paying Edward de Vere to write plays. That's connecting a few dots, trying to. Now, because Nicholas Rowe's position in this is so important as the first person to step up to the plate with new information, we need to know more about Nicholas Rowe. I always go to the Dictionary of National Biography. Nicholas Rowe was a very close friend. And as I have gone through this study, I've had a good many, they're called aha moments, or I like to call them oh my God moments. This was my first one. Nicholas Rowe was an extremely close associate, and they always call him close associate of, how many of you know much about this man, Alexander Pope? Yes, Alexander Pope, who was quite a schemer, by the way. The Dictionary of National Biography, of course, he was the leading man of letters through the first part of the 1700s, no question about that. And this is what the Dictionary of National Biography has to say about him. Pope was plunged from his youth into a wretched series of complex quarrels, maneuvers, and falsifications. He could hardly drink tea without a stratagem. What a guy. And he was the leading man of letters at the time. Now, oh my God, they were close friends by 1707. And these are the, as the biographers of both Pope and Rowe point out, in 1708, it was Rowe who introduced Pope's poetry to the literary world in the sixth part of Dryden's Poetic Miscellanies, of which Pope was the editor. So he was in a position to put Alexander Pope's work before the public. By 1709, their friendship had grown to the point that they regularly visited in each other's homes. By 1715, it was Pope who persuaded Rowe to apply for the job as poet laureate, which he did get. And in 1718, Pope was a witness of Nicholas Rowe's will. And after Nicholas Rowe died in December of 1718, Pope wrote the epitaph for Rowe's Westminster monument. Pretty close association, and over a long period of time, too. Now, something else that we must learn about is in the account of the life, Nicholas Rowe writes this: I must own a particular obligation to him. And if this, he is speaking of Thomas Betterton, the actor, the most famous Shakespearean actor of the time, for the most considerable part of these passages relating to his life, which I have here transmitted to the public, as we've already said, his veneration for the memory of Shakespeare having engaged him to make a journey into Warwickshire on purpose, to gather up what remains he could of a name for which he had so great a value. It's all very lovely. But it was even Kevin Gilvery, in his very fine article published in Brief Chronicles about this, says that even doubts early on came up that it wasn't believed that Thomas Betterton actually journeyed to Stratford-upon-Avon. Because for one thing, he's getting toward the end of his life and he's near retirement, or he's actually in retirement, and his health was very, very poor. And there are no records of him ever doing this, but at any rate, this is the authority upon which the life is based. We need to know a little bit more about Thomas Betterton. How was he associated with Nicholas Rowe? And was there any association with Alexander Pope, since I've now brought him out for us to be taking a look at? Actually, of course, Betterton was connected to Nicholas Rowe through the theater. Nicholas Rowe wrote his first play in 1700. Betterton produced it, and he acted in it. And his first play was The Ambitious Stepmother. And in 1701, Betterton starred in Rowe's next play, which was extremely well received by the public, called Tamerlane. So the theatrical connections between Rowe and Thomas Betterton are clear as they can be. No problems there. My next aha moment, though, is that, surprise the conceiving out of me, Betterton was far more closely associated with Alexander Pope than he was with Nicholas Rowe. Stunning. I would never have thought this. A few things to support this. Pope told his own biographer, I was acquainted with Betterton from a boy. This is where the acquaintance started. Betterton had a country home near the Pope's, and Alexander visited him regularly during the last years of Betterton's life, which coincides with the 1709 timeframe that Rowe's edition of Shakespeare's plays was underway. At Betterton's death in 1710, the next year, it was Pope who was his literary executor and brought some of his writings to press. Bolingbroke, one of Pope's friends, said, you and I knew Betterton and Mrs. Barry, one of the greatest actresses of the time, off the stage as well as on it, which indicates how closely associated Pope was with the theater and the people of the theatrical people of the time. So this is what I'm proposing this. I have several other reasons that I think can support it, but I believe that the first biography of Shakespeare, as the narrative says, was actually a construct put together by the three of them as a team. This is just my proposal. I believe that Betterton, though he did not go to Stratford, he did supply the theatrical lore, whatever was hanging around about Shakespeare at the time. I think Rowe supplied the publication venue. He's the one who had the contract with Jacob Tonson, the publisher, so he supplied the venue. And last of all, I think Pope was a mastermind. Because Pope was, after Nicholas Rowe died, Pope was pretty quick on his heels to be putting forth his own edition of Shakespeare. And he even has the same publisher that Nicholas Rowe had. What he did is he reinforced. One of the reasons I think he was part of it is because he reinforced it. He reinforces Nicholas Rowe's account of the life by repeating it almost exactly as it appeared in Rowe's 1709 edition. And for the next 100 years or even more, the Rowe Pope biography of Shakespeare was accepted as the industry standard, even though by the end of the 1700s it was pretty well accepted that, or understood that it was becoming rubbish. Still in all, this was the default position for the biography of Shakespeare. Now the plot is going to thicken. Okay, time-wise. Okay, here. Okay. The plot will thicken with this individual. Who recognizes him? Yes, of course. Actually, he is Robert Harley, and he is the first Earl of Oxford of the Second Creation. This is Robert Harley's son, Edward Harley, the second, who will be the second Earl of Oxford of the Second Creation. Think of them together as a father-son team because they were both on the same page, and so I look at them as sort of an entity. This is what Wikipedia has to say about Robert Harley, about his literary significance. Harley's importance to literature cannot be overstated. As a patron of the arts, he was notable. As a preservationist, he was invaluable. He used his wealth and power to collect an unparalleled library. He preserved Renaissance literature, and the collection with that of his son, Edward Harley, was sold to Parliament and became one of the mainstays of the British Museum when it was donated by the Countess of Oxford and her daughter, the Duchess of Portland. And right here, I should have put a slide with the Welbeck portrait of Edward de Vere that we see all the time, because that's where the Welbeck portrait, that's why it's called, this is through the family of the Duchess and Duke of Portland, that they own Welbeck Abbey, through this marriage. And that is why, that's where the portrait of Oxford is located to this day, at the Welbeck Abbey. Did I make that clear enough? Which is in the hands of the Duchess of the Portland family. And of course, the collection is now known as the Harleyan Collection. When Harley was in office, he promoted the careers of Jonathan Swift, Alexander Pope, and John Gay. This is the standard things that we know about him. A little less gushy appraisal. In the D&B, Harley was never to deal clearly or openly, but with dissimulation and to love tricks. If any man was ever born under a necessity of being a knave, he was. Giving you a lot of confidence in all this stuff, or we have ways to go here. Both Nicholas Rowe and Alexander Pope did their darndest and to ingratiate themselves with Robert Harley for this reason, because he was such a promoter of literary people and literature. And the person who was more successful at that was Alexander Pope. He became extremely close with a very enduring friendship after Robert Harley died with Robert Harley's son, Edward Harley. And I want to give you just a quick overview of the time frame. In 1721, at which point now Pope is working on his own edition of Shakespeare, he has much correspondence going back and forth with Robert Harley. When Robert Harley died in 1724, he immediately writes to Lord Edward Harley, and he's invited to visit with him for a month. That's not just dropping by for a cup of tea. He's not going to be staying with Edward Harley for an entire month at his country home. From this time on, until the second Earl of Oxford's death, Lord and Lady Oxford often visit Pope at Pope's home at Twickenham, which must have been quite a nice, lovely home. Pope had the use of the Oxford's London home, even when they were not in residence. If that tells you something about the trust that existed and the very close association and friendship that existed between these two and this family. And then Pope, of course, made the freest use of the Harleys' great library. Now, someone else we need to get to know who's in the Harley circle is this man, George Virtue, who was an engraver, very talented engraver. I get this information from Stephanie Hopkins Hughes, who I enjoyed so much giving a talk earlier. I wish she could be here so she could see how much I have used her material and how much I appreciate it. Virtue engraved the image of Shakespeare that Alexander Pope used in his 1725 edition of Shakespeare. Now, what Stephanie goes, and I suggest that you look up her article, because she shows how in this time preceding this, how people were casting about for an image of Shakespeare that they could work with. And the person who came up with this image was George Virtue. And as you can see, here it is in Pope's edition. Stephanie found that it was based on an unidentified miniature in Harley's collection. Don't know who it was, but they're going through, like I said, casting around for an image that works, and they picked up on this one. Virtue engraved it. They reversed image. There it is.
It's not Sir Thomas Overy, is it?
I don't think so. They don't. It's really it's unidentified as far as this goes. Yeah. Well, they were looking at a lot of images. They were going around, I think, trying to see what I say. Whoever were the editors and of these early Shakespeare in this time. And as I said, Stephanie's got a lot of information on that. Now, it was George Virtue who accompanied Edward Harley on his trip to Stratford-upon-Avon in 1737. And this sketch, which we've all seen a good many times. This is the second Earl of Oxford, Edward Harley, looking up at the Holy Trinity Church, looking up at the monument of Shakespeare on the wall, and sketched by his traveling companion, George Virtue. Now, because George Virtue is playing a pretty major part in this thing, developing the iconography, we really need to know more about George Virtue. And in the same year that he traveled with Edward Harley to Stratford-upon-Avon, he was coming up with a map. It was going to be a very important map called the Woodcut Map that he claimed was, he was reissuing this. He claimed it was executed in 1560. And read what we know about this map, about Virtue's work on this map. Virtue crowned his pretended copy with a date 1560 in Roman numerals, made palpable alterations, omissions, so that he might retain the delusive date, took other unwarrantable liberties with the object of disguising the fraud. This unhappy result of the tinkering of the original design was that numerous subsequent antiquaries were victims of the deception. Okay, when you start seeing words like this, pretended copy, alterations, omissions, delusive date, object of disguising the fraud, tinkering, deception, deceiving, is this somebody that you can really have confidence in? And it is this person who found Shakespeare's original will. It was, yes, in his notebooks from which this sketch comes. He writes that he understood that the original will, he found out when he was in Stratford, the original will was at the Doctors' Commons, and you can bet that he made it his way as fast as he could once he got back to London, to the Doctor's Commons, and he found the will. It was not acknowledged that he did until late in the 20th century. And in Honigman's book, Playhouse Wills, Honigman has it in very, very small little footnote at the bottom that the discovery is given to virtue at this date and not at a later date. Now, another nobleman we need to look at is this nice-looking man, also with his Royal Order of the Garter regalia. He is Richard Boyle, the 3rd Earl of Burlington. Yes. Now, this is really crucial to this story. In 1741, Burlington led the committee that put the Shakespeare statue in Westminster Abbey. Cannot possibly overstate how important this is in our story. Even Stratfordian Michael Dobson, in his book, calls it Burlington's committee. No question about that he led the committee. The statue was designed by Burlington's protege, William Kent. And Kent lived in the Burlington's home in his own apartments. He's buried it. He was no question. Anytime you see William Kent designing anything as an artist, it's being under the aegis of the Earl of Burlington. Now, the leading literary figure on Burlington's committee was, have we seen him somewhere before? It's just almost hard to believe. He's popping up again. Yes. Okay, the statue catapulted Shakespeare to a national hero, to the status of a national hero. The Burlington Project was the first monument in the Abbey, and I have this from a couple of books, so I've read this several times to make sure, because this is so hard to believe, but it was the first monument in the Abbey to be funded by public subscription. What this tells me is that this was a result of a real effort and campaign to bring this thing to the general public and to make them realize that this is something they should be interested in, that's making Shakespeare a national hero. Interestingly, they had some fundraising performances of Shakespeare's plays, and one of them didn't raise as much money as it was supposed to, and Burlington himself covered the shortfall. It was Pope. I don't know if you can see this. Let's see. Up here at the top, it says this word, amor. This means with public love. And this was Alexander Pope made sure that the public was going to understand that this isn't here because of Lord Burlington. Heavens, no. It's there because of the love of the public. And that was Alexander Pope's specific effort to get that put there. Now, because the Earl of Burlington is so important, we need to know more about the Earl of Burlington. So again, I go to the Dictionary of National Biography, and I can't find, I check out everything at the university library where I study. Couldn't really find much of anything. There are all kinds of relatives that the Earl of Burlington has that are important, and not one of these sources told me this. Promise you say, okay, how do I know this? If not, doesn't come from a single source that I was looking at. And this was one of my aha moments that happened about 2 a.m. in the morning. I was reading a book on Lady Anne Clifford, someone I've studied intently, and I gave a little scream, and I woke Jack up, making Jack very aggravated with me. But the Earl of Burlington is a direct descendant of Robert Cecil. Any surprises there? Okay. He is a descendant through his daughter. Robert Cecil had 2 surviving children, and he is a descendant through the daughter, which is why the name changed. She married a Clifford, which is why I found it in the Clifford book, and then she only had 1 surviving daughter who married a Boyle. So that's how the name gets to the Boyle family. She is the great or great-great-grandmother of Richard Boyle, 3rd Earl. Motivation. So this gives us, we're now moving on to motivation. And this is really pretty simple, or simple-minded, maybe too much on my part, but this is what I think. Edward Aveer, the 17th Earl of Oxford, was a member of the Cecil family through his marriage to Anne Cecil. We all know it was a troubled marriage, generated much bitterness between Oxford and the Cecils, and I know I'm mispronouncing it, but sometimes it doesn't stick in people's minds who are newer to this if you don't say Cecil. So correctly, Cecils. Oxford took his revenge By satirizing his father-in-laws, Polonius and Hamlet, among other things, the Cecil family and others in the aristocracy did not take kindly to the unflattering characterizations of them on the public stage. Basically, in our modern terms, Oxford doxed them, putting private and personal information like the precepts to a son in front of the public to find out who it was. And you can look at Mark Anderson's phenomenal book, which we've all been talking about off and on throughout this conference. And he has a lot more information about the other people and other people who are characterized. Fast forward to the next century. If posterity knew who Shakespeare was, then it would be easy to identify the noble people who are now in less than noble characterizations of the plays, suppressing the identity of Oxford as the author and developing a narrative about the Stratford man. Solve the problem. Now we don't have a problem. We had a problem. Now we don't have a problem. Great. Why not? Everyone who knew anything's dead and gone. Who can contradict it? So here we have the team. Here's a real team. It could be in the NBA, National Football League, whatever, hockey. You've got your owners of the team. You've got the head coach who's making the plays and coaching them on the shots. You have your quarterbacks who are executing the shots. Nicholas Rowe, George Virtue, William Kent. And there's some other players. There were some other running backs on this team, but this is enough to take in at one time. They had done a fine job. Yes, they really had. They had brought the Stratford narrative to the attention of the English people and made Shakespeare Britain's national deity. In fact, how nice of Michael Dobson to put it so eloquently when he says that the author that called to Shakespeare has functioned as a kind of religion. That it has functioned as a kind of religion is one that few cultural anthropologists would dispute. It was in the 1700s, and this is actually the point of Dobson's book, that it was in the 1700s that Shakespeare was enshrined as the transcendent personification of a national ideal. Lovely. There were just a few loose ends now to tidy up. A serious loose end looked a lot like this. If people went to Westminster Abbey after 1741, they're going to see this pleasant-looking man leaning on the pedestal with a stack of books on it. Perfectly appropriate. Very nice. But then they're really curious, so they go to the Holy Trinity Church, and they're going to see this on the wall. It's not going to work out really well. They're going to know that something is just really not quite right with the woolsack man. So the idea is to take this, and of course we know what the woolsack man looked like really from the Holler engraving. The trick is to transform this into this. And I direct your attention to Richard Wayland's extremely fine article, very detailed, very comprehensive. It's been published several times in the Oxfordian, and it's called The Stratford Bust, A Monumental Fraud, where Richard Wayland tracked more details than I'm going to have time to give you right now, but how the Reverend Joseph Green had the bust beautified and refurbished in 1749. According to Richard, it was Vicar Green who engineered the change from a gloomy sack holder to a cheerful writer. Richard also has this very significant comment. The visit of Harley and Virtue, getting back to the visit of Harley and Virtue, in 1737, shortly after Green's appointment as vicar. How interesting is that? May suggest a meeting of the minds on the problem of the sack-holding effigy, and that having obtained the tacit approval of the Stratford fathers, Green, who was the vicar, and on record as Heath, who was a carver, and Hall, who was a painter, silently created a more appropriate bust in 1749, following the figure as suggested by Virtue's 1725 engraving for Pope's edition of Shakespeare. I totally agree with Richard Wayland. Let's see. Now, there was another problem. And these next few slides are going to be a little bit sad. I've tried to think of how I can make it funnier and more amusing, and I can't. So brace yourself. This is a picture of the new place from George Virtue's notebooks that he made after that trip to Stratford, that he made with the Earl of Oxford, second Earl of Oxford. Now, the home itself was quite a fine place, very impressive structure. It was a 3-story house that had 10 chimneys. We know that from the hearth taxes. A chimney usually meant it had between 2 and 3 bedrooms. So this house had at least 20 bedrooms. How many of us are living in a 20-bedroom home? It had gables, it had bay windows, it had servants' quarters, a courtyard, gardens, barns, orchards, and stables. Yes, it was quite a fine property. In 1756, and he had bought it to keep that name, to be sure of that date is in mind. In 1753, the clergyman bought this house. 3 years later, he had the mulberry tree in Shakespeare's garden cut down. And this generated a flurry of angst amongst the people of Stratford. But it turned out to have some serendipity because it became a bountiful source of relics in the next decade on the run-up to the Shakespeare Jubilee. Shops in Stratford that got a hold of the wood, supposedly from the mulberry tree, turned out knickknacks of dishes, tea chests, tobacco stoppers, toothpick cases, all kinds of things came from wood from the mulberry tree. But 3 years later, after this, in 1759, the clergyman had the house torn down. Now, this has bothered me for a long time. I've known about this for decades and decades and decades. And why would somebody destroy a very fine property? Was it in bad shape? No. Apparently, it had been redone by the subsequent owners earlier to Shakespeare or previous owners in the century. So far as we know, it was in good shape. But this is the best that I can come up with. The optics of this extremely impressive structure were just not acceptable when a narrative is being put forth to people. Most people who are coming through now, they live in a 2-room cottage, which they're renting. That this home is just not quite the right tone for someone who is being promoted to the people as their people's poet. That's what I think. And their national hero. It just didn't quite work. Now, here's the official story. There are 2 slightly different takes on it. The Reverend Francis Gastrell, who is the clergyman, he retired to Stratford, and he became aggravated. He became aggravated because this narrative was coming along. We're talking the 1750s, and what are referred to as peepers and gawkers are now coming there, and they're pointing at his house. And that is one reason why he had the mulberry tree cut down. In 1756, that's when he took out his irritation on the mulberry tree. Poor tree. But cutting down a tree is one thing. Destroying a fine structure, which surely was a landmark in Stratford-upon-Avon, that's a little bit more draconian. The historical account was published 50 years later. And it has this to say, that Gastrell refused to pay a monthly assessment for the benefit of poor people in Stratford. What a nice clergyman is that? Gee. And he said, get this, that he was living most of the time in Litchfield. He's not even living there. Why is he so angry about the peepers and the gawkers? He's living in Litchfield. When the corporation insisted, he vowed that his house would never be assessed again and had the entire building demolished. Now, why would somebody take a big hit and incur a big loss by demolishing a very sizable structure, not to be able to take a relatively small amount of money for an assessment for poor people? Does that make sense? Come on. Where am I wrong in this? Now, so I really want to know more about who this Francis Gastrell was, because somebody somewhere is taking a loss. Francis Gastrell, I went to the Dictionary of National Biography, and much to my surprise, there was a Gastrell, Francis. And this Gastrell, however, is not the same Gastrell. This is a bishop. The other person is a reverend, been a vicar. It's a long way to go to get to be a bishop. But the Reverend Gastrell is indeed Bishop Gastrell's nephew. Took me a lot of effort to be able to nail this down, but this is absolutely nailed down. Now, Bishop Gastrell, his career was launched in 1701 when he became the personal chaplain for, and I'm going to give you a little hint, one of the people on this slide. And now we're going to play Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? And we're going to cut it down with a 50-50 option. It is either one of these owners. It is either the Earl of Oxford or the Earl of Burlington. If you knew the dates, and if you were going to be looking at Googling the dates, you'd figure it out pretty quick. But who wants to vote for the Earl of Oxford? Okay, have a call. Who wants to vote for the Earl of Burlington? Well, if you knew the dates, you'd get it, because actually he was in 1701, the Earl of Burlington was a much younger man, and he was just a boy. He had not come into his majority at that point. So I'm sorry about that, because I didn't give you all that information to work with. Yeah, it's Robert Harley. Bishop Gastrell's career was launched when he became the personal chaplain for Robert Harley, when Harley became Speaker of the House of Commons, and that was as powerful a position then as a Speaker of the House is today. It is a powerful, powerful position. And Harley was and Gastrell was Harley's personal chaplain. He also, thanks to Harley's patronage, Gastrell became canon of Christ Church in Oxford, a very major church. Being a canon is a far greater thing than being a vicar. Gastrell became chaplain to Queen Anne, all this under the influence and patronage of Robert Harley, the Earl of Oxford. Actually, this is the time, wasn't going to say this, but in 1711 is when Harley actually became the first Earl of Oxford of the second creation. That's when this was done, that the title was given to him. And then Gastrell became the Bishop of Chester in 1714. And when Gastrell died, the bishop was the family was so fond of him that Edward Harley, at this point, now the second Earl of Oxford, he paid George Virtue to engrave Gastrell's portrait. The family was very close, and I think it certainly suggests that Gastrell owed his successful career in the clergy to Robert Harley and the Harley family. Let's look a little bit more at Francis Gastrell's family. Bishop Francis Gastrell was the younger of two brothers in the Gentry family. The bishop had no surviving sons, but his brother's son, Francis Gastrell, was his namesake and followed him into the clergy, along with the Gastrell family property, because the younger Gastrell gets the family property because he's the descendant of the older brother. The bishop is the younger brother. So the younger brother's got the money, which explains how he had the money to buy a fine mansion home to start with. But the younger Gastrell inherited the family connection to the formidably powerful Harley family. I wasn't really good. These are just my musings. I don't know what the motivation is. I don't know. But all I can say is that it is a fact that a man from a family closely aligned with the powerful Harley, Earls of Oxford, destroyed Shakespeare, put that in air quotes, destroyed Shakespeare's house. And that is very sad and very troubling. Now, we'll end on a little bit more upbeat note here. A lot of work had been done to set the stage when David Garrick came to Stratford in the summer of 1769 to make the plans for his Jubilee. The embarrassing monument in the church had been changed out. We now have a more cheerful figure. The embarrassingly inappropriate mansion house was gone, and the mulberry tree was merrily producing enough wood to build a ship for the king's navy. Things were going along quite well, I'd say. Attended by thousands, the 1769 Jubilee brought Garrick and his associates a fourfold return on every shilling they had ventured in Stratford. A commentator grumbled, "It is no wonder that he should endeavor to make a god of Shakespeare, since he has usurped the office of his high priest and has gained money enough by it to make a golden calf." I'll take questions.